Good morning and a very hearty welcome to the panelists, the esteemed panelists, the knowledge partner Deloitte and all participants. And at the outset, I thank Bombay Chamber of Commerce uh, to give me the opportunity to flag off and deliver the welcome address of this very important session. So on behalf of Bombay Chamber of Commerce, I again welcome all the panelists and all the participants. The topic is of this webinar is post-COVID changes and challenges and transformations to supply chains, uh, and also the way forward to cope with these challenges. That would be the second session, as I understand. Now, friends, this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, as we call it, is perhaps the most important and significant black swan event that has occurred in the last century, definitely, and perhaps even earlier. And truly, many people are saying that history will be divided into before COVID and after COVID, just as it was before Christ and after Christ. Now, when the pandemic hit us with a huge mega force, end-to-end supply chain, end-to-end supply chain, beginning from procurement of inputs, manufacturing, processing, backroom operations, and last mile delivery to the consumer, as well as underwent huge shocks. Consumer behavior, vendor selection, all traditional logistics model and matrices all underwent certain changes. Uh, and industry, manufacturers, marketeers had to dig into their last reserves of adaptation, resilience, and innovation for many just to survive, and for some who were more successful in this to even thrive in this pandemic period. Now, I will just give an example as a layman only of what, giving some examples, how things broke upon us. Now, I think it was 21st or 22nd March of 2020 when the Prime Minister in his 8 p.m. address said that from midnight there would be a lockdown. And then all hell broke loose. Essential factories were allowed to run, but the question is who would run the factories? Workers stopped coming. Many workers left for their home places. This quickly snowballed into what we know as the migrant crisis. Factory owners struggled to get people inside the factory and keep them observing in the logistics, in the transportation industries, drivers, helpers, etc. left. Trucks were stranded on the way. However, apart from coping with the traditional challenges, people quickly realized, the marketeers and sales functions quickly realized another big thing, that consumers, because of work from home, no longer wanted to come to the traditional outlets like shops, malls, etc. to pick up. And so delivery there was not that important. Everyone wanted home delivery. And that led to one huge paradigm shift in supply chain, the growth of e-commerce and digital platforms, the growth and the start of the big baskets and the Amazons. Consumer behavior also underwent several changes, and with that there was stockouts there was spurt in demand for, say, essentials, medical supplies, dispensers, etc., uh, leading to sudden stockouts. And in certain other goods, nobody wanted to buy, and there was a risk of obsolescence, even though normal safety stocks uh, had been kept. In fact, I read an interesting anecdote in a McKinsey report that in the US, suddenly there was a drop in the demand for office grade toilet paper and a huge spurt in demand on home grade toilet paper within the same category. So things, all the matrices like safety stocks, planning, etc., sales planning, all underwent. Now the changes here were end to end. I mean, they didn't affect what we call as the traditional pillars of supply chain, which is procurement, uh, processing, manufacturing, logistics, and sales delivery, but even other functions. For example, in the legal function, it became a matter of huge debate of how to build in force majeure clauses in contracts, whether the Indian Contract Act provides for force majeure or not. In finance, people had to do the number crunching on the cash flows, on the hits of the PNL, etc., and how to overcome. In HR, new protocols had to emerge on how to run workplaces, new compensation structures, whether in work from home, people should get the same salaries or less, and even layoffs, etc., had to be negotiated. Now, this is as far as India. At the international level, there was a outpouring at the time of the COVID. There was also coincidentally the US China trade war, and the aversion to China, the US China trade war, led to a, a growth of what I may call economic nationalism across countries and a desire to move away from China. So that led to new challenges: where to relocate, how to relocate, whether regional hubs or country-wise hubs. And mind you, the consumer still, however, whether it is China or elsewhere, still continues to believe that he must get the cheapest goods. So how to balance and trade off this? So this is just a flavor of the huge amount of shocks and new challenges that COVID has thrown up. And therefore, it is very pertinent today that we have this session, because these challenges, according to me and many other experts, will remain even after the COVID is gone. It will come in some form or the other. And the only thing that will be certain is there will be uncertainties, there will be changes, and how to develop a model uh, which will help industry and marketeers to continuously cope with changes, like whether we should have a dynamic multi-scenario sales planning and logistics planning instead of the earlier traditional systems, etc. So how to cope with changes would also be a leg in today's or a session in today's webinar. So with all this, and in my limited way, trying to give you relevance of what has happened and how it is connected with today's session, I request the panel speakers to take over and wish all the best for a very, very fruitful session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. Thanks for the some of the anecdotes which were very interesting, and what really as you said, has impacted the supply chains of companies. And if you really look at, and over as he said, many of them were very in situ, and therefore companies had to react on the fly. And I think over a period of time, organizations started understanding what are the 5 key dimensions or the 6 key dimensions that they have to address. And what we thought is we'll put together some of those that you would essentially be looking at. You would have encountered some of these earlier, and possibly looking at addressing some of them as you go by. One of the first and the most fundamental things that we will discuss with our panelists later too is around the role of visibility in supply chain. Till now, we were really not worried beyond our first year of either the market in terms of distributors or dealers, or the first year of the supply. I think what the entire COVID pandemic situation has brought about is the keenness, and therefore the necessity to start looking beyond the first year, and therefore the role of end-to-end visibility within the supply chain. That, I think, has become a very important dimension for us to look at. Unfortunately, what is happening right now, even as we speak, while the context of demand visibility has been made very visible to companies, demand sensing is still very immature in many places. And therefore, while there is an aspiration to look at end-to-end visibility, it is factored and it is structured through a process of demand sensing, which is very immature. So that is something that many companies are really now trying to address, and see how we can bring in end-to-end visibility coupled with a fairly mature demand sensing situation, which also has some algorithms and therefore some technologies assigned to that. The second one, which is becoming very relevant outside some of the ones which have already been discussed earlier, is really around the significance of product development and life cycle. If you really look at what has happened in the last 18 months without our knowledge, one of the things that has impacted every organization is that there is lack of clarity on discretionary spend of consumers. The patterns that we had earlier are no more available, and therefore companies are really looking at what are the near and medium term impacts that they're going to have from a product development and a life cycle perspective. So the earlier product development models and therefore the life cycles of products have today become a little bit irrelevant. So you order some things far more. I think he spoke about one or two examples. Some of them you order far more than some, but the patterns keep changing by the quarter and therefore by the year. So to that extent, some of your old hypotheses are no more working. And that's becoming a very important driver for organizations to rethink their entire product development and therefore the life cycle too. How many new products to launch over the next 6 months is becoming a big and critical issue for companies. And we'll talk to our panelists around that. The third one is around the changing view of the workforce itself. And if you really look at what the changing view of the workforce itself is, the fundamental aspect is around flexibility now. Now, till now, we were worried really about specific skills on the job. We used to monitor attendance, we used to monitor productivity at the workplace, etc. But today, with all these new dimensions of workforce flexibility, those old terms of really looking at workforce have changed. The second is, and I think I'm sure we'll speak about it a little bit, this impact of digitization and digitalization has really also changed the nature of workforce. So to that extent, who were you measuring? What were you measuring them for, and how were you addressing them are becoming very, very different. And therefore, I think that is possibly the third area that everybody is grappling with. And to me, I think all three problems are still unsolved, which is what we will discuss as we go by. The fourth one, which has really become very, very relevant, is the need for scenario plans. I spoke about the fact that, demand sensing is a challenge. And therefore, the preferences of customers and consumers, be it both business to business or business to consumer, discretionary spend is changing. And therefore, what is happening is that companies are unable to predict as to what they would do in the near term. So the best way that they can do is to really ensure that they have the most maximized objective function, be it profitability, be it revenues, be it volumes, or be it addressing the needs of their most important customers. All that can only be scenarioed for a set of inputs and a set of constraints. So to that extent, what I'm seeing most companies really looking at now, and the CEOs of companies looking at, and supply chain becoming a very important dimension in that, is really around scenario planning for a range of sensitivities on across variables. So that is something that everybody is really looking for, and therefore ensuring that they're able to optimize all their assets in the most important manner to satisfy their business objectives. That is something which is becoming very relevant. So people are now starting to look at, let's say, I'm sorry, people are now starting to look at the impact of COVID-related metrics on supply chain. Things like not factor, things like COVID fatality rate. And therefore, they are starting to look at new metrics in supply chain, which they were not looking at earlier. And finally, the whole thing is around, I think, it was spoken about in terms of workplace and protocols, but essentially organizations are now looking at what they call return to work protocol and how they can actually ensure that everybody is safe in a collective environment. While we are now looking at a 30%, 50% workforce, etc., a near term with all the vaccinations, we are obviously going to have 100%, but then what new protocols have come in? And these new protocols are with the new normal, because, in the last 1 year or 15 months, we have experimented and we have found that there is also the ability to enhance productivity. Therefore, that is something that we are doing. And with all this in context, really organizations are ensuring both in the supply chain as well as in the front end that the stocks are healthy, the employees are healthy, as well as therefore the workplace is essentially in the new construct. So these are the 5 big areas that companies are trying to grapple with. And frankly, since I have not seen most of them having prescribed solutions for each one of them, we'll possibly discuss it with the panel as we move forward. But the whole intent was to really look at these dimensions and say how organizations are grappling with these and how they are trying to address these. So, with these words, Sumit, back to you, and for us to take us through the next interactions.
Thank you, Ishwar, and this is very useful, and thank you, Mr. Roy, as well. We now have a couple of guest speakers amongst us. Puneet Sabharwal, he's the CFO at Stellantis, the combined organization that is formed now after the integration of PSA and Fiat Chrysler. I would like to invite Puneet to maybe share a few of his initial thoughts around this particular topic as a CFO of a large organization, and what kind of challenges he has seen, and what is his guiding light at this difficult time in managing the financials of a company or a business which is particularly impacted by COVID and its wherewithal. Puneet?
Thank you, Sumit. Good morning to everyone. Kashyap, can you put up the slide, please? I'm sorry, I can't see the slides.
Could you move the slides? We are still on the slide that we had with Easwaran.
Yeah. Thank you, Kashyap. So this is the agenda. I won't be taking each and every line item there. So it's just, I'm sorry, Kashyap, I cannot see the slides. Yeah, so our industry was grappling a lot of challenges even before even before COVID struck. We had trade tensions between US and China, which was escalating, and there were tariff wars which were all across and impacting various countries, including India. We've seen a lot of economic nationalism. Shavik also talked about it, and Easwaran too. And there were lots of financial barriers which were being put in place. So under these scenarios, what should be the business rationale, and how should the business be moving around? So supply chain does make a very important facet into that, and how a supply chain makes the impact is that it should bring in the material at the bare minimum lead time with the lowest possible price. So this is how things were working on before COVID hit us. And when COVID hit us, what did we encounter? Next slide, please, Kashyap. So when COVID came, that's when at least my industry really identified how single source dependencies have its own hidden cost. So automobile industry, I represent the automobile industry here, and automobile industry generally does single sourcing for its components and parts, which forms 80 to 85% of our total revenue is on this supply chain activity. So the dependency is that we develop single source part suppliers. Why do we do that? Is because there's a heavy investment on tooling that goes in. If we source in from multiple suppliers, there would be more capex which would have to be spent. And automotive is a high capex intensive industry, so it doesn't make sense to have multiple sources producing same parts. However, there are companies like Maruti and Hyundai who have enough volumes that they need to have their sourcing done. But players like us and the other 80% of the car manufacturers, the single source dependencies are there. So COVID really identified what are the hidden costs in there. Does that mean that the industry is going to shift from a single source to multiple source dependencies? I doubt in the near future it would happen because of the capex involved into it. But still, there would be a lot of new initiative which would be taken into this particular item on the agenda. Poor flexibility in material procurement. Now, how do we say it to be a poor flexibility? Is we have long-term contracts which are there with the various component suppliers. So we, as such, and this goes for most of the capital intensive industries, that these long term contracts would be very difficult from a flexibility standpoint. We do not have the flexibility. Maybe pricing is one area that there could be, but we saw with the COVID-19 situation, the suppliers were in a pretty tardy position, and it was impacting the P&L of each and every chain in the supply chain. So, and in fact, the suppliers were more looking upwards to the OEMs for support during this period. So, uh, it really brought into the automotive industry as to whether the whole business, the way it is being done, needs to be relooked into or not. I think a lot of these efforts are underway today. Strategically, a lot of decisions are being taken in the boardroom as to how do we come out of this inflexible material procurement. Uh, Due to the weakening of the globalized manufacturing system, we saw a lot of shortages in the components that are used for the manufacture. A small chip uh, uh, really is still impacting the industry in a big way. We have a shortage of microchips, which is impacting worldwide. And why did this situation all of a sudden occur? It is not that suddenly there are more automotive cars flying on the road. That's not the case. It so happened that the microchip producers were asked to cut orders by the automotive companies, and because they were not producing the cars, so they did not require that. So the microchip manufacturers was told to cut the supplies. Now, these are generally small investment companies, but at the same time, production capacities are pretty high. But the usage is pretty high on the mobile and computing devices. So suddenly, the trajectory from the chip manufacturers was to move from automotive to the mobile devices and the computing devices. So today, automotive is not their priority, and automotive looks after a it's a very small business for the chip manufacturers. So I'm just taking this as an example because this is the issue which automotive is still grappling, and it will still be grappling for another year or so. Maybe by year 2022, we are going to see some rationality coming back on the chip manufacturing. We also saw that the commodity prices are going through the roof today. The steel price is at its all-time high. The rare earths are pretty high at this point of time, and all of these are basic ingredients to make a automobile. So we've seen P&Ls getting impacted because of this, and the situation is purely because of the pandemic, the mining activity not happening. So it's a dearth of supply which is creating this artificial price increase. So, these are the impacts that COVID has in general happened on the automotive industry, and most of it is getting impacting on the P&Ls of all the auto suppliers. Next slide. So these are the disruptions which have happened. I've already spoken about most of it. The raw material shortages, I've spoken. The transporters unavailability. COVID-19 was further enhanced by the Suez Canal blockade. We had our supplies impacting. Today, the freight companies have jacked up their prices like anything. They are again at a all-time high. 3x to 4x prices is what we are paying today for any shipment coming from Europe or US. Um, uh, we saw that the ports are not operational, and which led to a lot of disruption in the supply chain from a automotive standpoint. So I think these are things which are going to be there for the short term and maybe in the long term too, which we really need to grapple as an industry. And as a CFO, these are certain things which are always on the radar now. They never used to be there because like my preceding speakers have said that supply chain was supposed to be done. Like it's a seamless operation. You set up a dealer network, you set up a supplier base, and then everything is seamless. But not today. It is going to be a discussion point at the boardrooms and in various discussions as to how do we create that optimized supply chain with more disruptions and newer technologies to be brought in. So this is my a bit on the CFO view on the disruption which may or may not be coming in the supply chain activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Puneet. I think this was quite interesting because some of these perspectives, I'm sure people in this room, do relate to. But I think coming from you and some of the knowledge tidbits that you shared, I think these are helpful, useful, and at least give others a sense that some of these are common issues that are being dealt with by the industry at large. And hopefully the environment that we are in and where each company, each business finds itself in is going to propel some bit of a overall change and an overall upliftment of the quality and standards of all business operations that we have in the country. So I think that's very useful, and thank you very much, Puneet, for that. Just to share with the audiences, and Puneet, all the best with the new launch that you have of Citroën. I think that's something that all of us are looking out as well, and hopefully the market will shape up well to embrace the very versatile car that you are about to launch in the market.
Thank you, Sumeet.
Okay, next we have amongst us also a specialist in the supply chain area. A very experienced hand. His name is Sridhar Kulkarni. He's the director operations at a large confectionery, Perfetti Van Melle, and a name that all of us would have heard about. Of course, with families and kids, the kind of product portfolio that Perfetti Van Melle has, I think it's not a name too far away from close to being close to our hearts. So Shridhar comes with a 29 plus years of multi-country experience in sourcing, making, moving aspects of supply chain, and he's had diverse industry-based experience as well, spanning across not only confectionery and consumer goods FMCG that he's into right now, but also glass and petrochemicals. He's been involved with several strategy-related matters. Not to mention, he's the chairman of the steering committee at CII, and he comes in with a wealth of experience in the supply chain side. And over the last year and a half of the pandemic, I'm sure he's had his hands more than full in getting in shape and sizing up what changes he needs to make into his supply chain, and has some guiding points for all of us on this call. So either with that, I want to invite you, if you could please take over.
Thank you, Sumit. And thank you, BCCI, Deloitte, and thank you, participants. Good morning to all. and wishing all a happy, very happy World Lollipop Day. Today, by the way, is the World Lollipop Day. Coming back to, I have one chart, and I think the stage has been very well set by speakers earlier, Easwaran, Mr. Roy, as well as Puneet. The 5 fundamental trends that emerged. The first one was, and Puneet also mentioned this earlier, supply chain was always considered an important function. But COVID-19 brought supply chain right at the center point in boardroom conversations. A lot of organizations and multiple companies have done research around it. We're definitely wanting to get into digitization, but for some reason or the other, the pace was a bit slow. Definitely COVID changed the game, and organizations across the board in the FMCG space aggressively pursued digitization, and right from demand sensing, the point that Ishwar mentioned, to finally delivering the product to the consumer. The initial deployment in terms of digitization was more in the supply chain planning space. Then the execution got added, and now it is right up to the customer. So you have transportation management systems, demand sensing coming up, hyperlocal solutions coming in. And one change, at least in India, that we have seen is a lot of good startups emerging and playing in the space and really adding value to different organizations by bringing in very solid solutions. The second piece is talent. With the increased deployment of tech solutions, the need for talent in the future is going to be talent who fundamentally are digital natives. Does that mean the existing talent is not important? No. So definitely the existing talent is important. So organizations are looking at how do we upskill the existing talent, ensure a very seamless transfer of the knowledge capital that has been gained over the years, and train the incoming talent as well, who are Gen Zs and millennials and digital natives, relatively far better digital natives. The other is aspect of talent, which is apart from skill and competency, that came up is the emotional impact of COVID on everybody. All of us went through a significant impact in one way or the other. But I think supply chain as a function is a function which typically works around the clock. And COVID wave 2, as all of us are aware, has had a significant impact emotionally as well. So that's one piece, one learning, I would say, from COVID wave 2 versus COVID wave 1. And that should be that organizations, different organizations are looking at all the functions now to see how do we also keep the emotional aspect covered. Logistics and distribution, and Mr. Roy alluded to that fact. When COVID wave 1 happened, thousands of trucks were stranded on the road. Unfortunately, because it was lockdown which was declared immediately, many of the truck drivers didn't have money, and there was no food available. The roadside dhabas were closed. So apart from just wanting to get the vehicles released faster and reach the destinations, one learning was also how do we ensure that people are, if you were to really look at the tip of the supply chain, our drivers are a very critical component of our supply chain. So how do we ensure that organizations work with the logistics service providers to take care of them? That became one key aspect. The other thing that came up was post the supply chain, the disruption in 19 was organizations are now exploring multimodal options, and with the hopefully that we will have a solid implementation of DFC. Organizations are looking at exploring road plus rail plus inland waterway. So that would be one future trend that will emerge for sure. Customer expectations, needless to add, D2C has emerged as a very clear focus area. FMCGs, by and large, tend to be more general trade oriented. Over the last 5 to 7 years, a lot of focus has been put on the alternate channels. I think COVID has just forced every organization to double click on the alternate channels even more. And a lot of organizations are coming up with different strategies, standing up teams, bringing in technology, working with customers to ensure that the alternate channel is the future growth area, and how do we ensure solid service levels and bring up new products. So there's a lot of focus now from the R&D teams in different organizations to come up with options, more product portfolio options for the alternate channel. Needless to add, and as always happens on a lighter note, I was preceded by Puneet, who is the CFO. Emphasis on costs was always there earlier, will continue. And supply chain, since it sits in the middle of the spine in a P&L, the drive would be to figure out how do we do more in terms of compressing this middle of the spine cost without sacrificing any aspects of quality, delivery, and customer service. So these were the 5 quick key trends that I wanted to share today. Over to you, Sumeet.
Thank you, Shridhar. Thank you for those inputs. I think very valuable in an environment where we find ourselves in, and making sure that people on this call have an idea that these are a few of the highlight items on which businesses have been paying attention. You yourself have been paying attention, and I guess measure high in hierarchy in terms of how you need to solve for some of these important areas. I think over the next 2-3 minutes, what I will do is quickly talk through some of the tax and regulatory imperatives that have been guiding some of the developments over the last few weeks and months. And I didn't want to labor on on some of these too much, but aspects like cutting down of corporate tax rate down to 15% for new manufacturing companies, 22% for normal companies. I think those provide a huge fillip. I think those rates tend to be some of the lowest rates in the Southeast Asian region. So if businesses are looking to expand, India presents a great opportunity, not only in terms of a low tax rate, but also a huge market and a huge supply with a huge supply ramp-up capability. So all in all, rings in as a very significant step taken by the government of India. The change of the DDT regime to the normal dividend tax regime, I think that gives another fillip, because you no longer are stuck with the dividend distribution tax cost of approximately 20-22%. But now you can potentially take a credit of the dividend tax, withholding tax that is paid in India under the tax treaty framework. So that gives an additional leg in reducing the cost as such of tax in doing business in India. Dispute resolution has been high on the government's agenda. They've been introducing forums. The AAR has been recently revamped. Of course, there are all kinds of views around it, but it just goes to show that the government is looking at making sure that disputes are handled more at the initial stage and not letting them balloon into large matters. Some of the tax treaty networks provide great opportunity for tax planning in a way, not the kind of word that international governments have been pushing as something or promoting, But I think even within the presence of what's legal and what's within the legal framework, there are opportunities that the wide tax treaty network that India has tends to offer. I think one of the key issues that multinationals typically deal with is cash repatriation from India, and generally that area of activity has been becoming tighter and tighter from the perspective of foreign multinational corporations, and therefore the opportunities for those cash repatriation ideas and strategies could potentially be more and more restricted. But nevertheless, with all the attention maybe paid towards some of the repatriation that had been happening in the past, whether fair or unfair, I think there still are some presentable opportunities that can confer some advantages and for companies to think and bake on. A slight negative step in terms of equalization levy, where the government has introduced a fairly widely worded scoped levy on international e-commerce operators, and the scope of the levy is so wide that even normal businesses would tend to get covered. So it's been a bone of contention in terms of applicability. So something for businesses to watch out on and take some technical positions if they're comfortable with some of those. And there are some interesting avenues to be able to take those technical positions around equalization levy. So just leaving a thought on the table on that particular point. Two quick points. One, return filing, Philip, for companies that don't have a base in India, which is a good move by the government, where income is taxed on a gross basis, royalty or fees for technical services. And the second is where you're able to employ labor whose compensation is low. You get some incentives on the income tax side for their compensation cost. We move to the next slide, Prashant. Similarly, on the indirect tax side, there are a number of schemes that the government of India has been floating. PLI has been one of the important ones. State incentives happen to be another one. The special economic zones have consistently offered in a very interesting regime for players to set up, export-oriented units in India. Exports in themselves are tax-free, and therefore that presents a great opportunity. India has been actively negotiating free trade agreements, and the free trade agreement with Europe is looking up, with the UK is looking up, and therefore there is hope that a lot more work will be put in towards the end, by the end of this year, to make some of these free trade agreements, which have been elusive for all these years, a reality maybe towards the end of the year. Could you move to the next slide, Kashyapi? One final slide before I hand back to Easwar is on the constant relaxations that the government of India has been putting up. Of course, not on the multi-brand retail side, but at least on manufacturing, the relaxations that the government has been giving, that it's not necessary that you yourself must manufacture in India. You could have a manufacturing profile by having a contract manufacturing arrangement with a company in India, and that gives a fillip because it allows you to do retail sales in India directly by virtue of being profiled as a manufacturing entity. So that gives a fair bit of flexibility for companies that are looking to set up shop here in India, maybe somewhat in the retail trade zone, but able to get into some contract manufacturing arrangements to be able to leverage all kinds of distribution channels, whether it is online, offline, single brand, multi-brand. Of course, is a sensitive area at this point in time. A lot of the procedures have been simplified by the government. Entity structures have been simplified. There are several forms of entities depending upon what is the kind of activity you are looking to create in India. Digital has been impacting all tax and regulatory developments in a big way, because a lot of the withholding taxes, a lot of the other taxes that have been applying have been considering digital development of businesses. So it's an area to watch out for, even from a tax and regulatory standpoint. The labor code is the unified labor codes are, of course, providing an opportunity again for businesses to recalibrate their payroll cost and some of the angles and aspirations around that. And last, and needless to mention, I think the whole fillip being given to to manufacturing in terms of the various incentives happens to give a fair bit of opportunity for multinational businesses and even domestic businesses or local businesses or India founded businesses to look to manufacturing in India in a significant way. This opportunity of the corporate income tax rate is only up to March 31, 2023, which is the end date by which the manufacturing must start. And therefore, if you have plans of starting manufacturing operations in India, something that you would want to actively consider and maybe potentially even fast track, because if the government does not extend that window, then the 15% tax rate would be gone, and then the only other tax rate that might be available is the 22% tax rate. So with that, Easwaran, I wanted to hand it over to you, maybe for a quick a few questions on the panel.
Yeah. Thanks, Sumeet. I think thanks to all of you, Mr. Roy, Shridhar, Puneet, and yourself for some great insights. And therefore, I just thought I'll pick up a couple of the most interesting questions that came about. And Shridhar, maybe I'll start with you. You spoke about in your 5 trends. I think the first thing was about digitization, and you had written about things associated with logistics. Talked about transportation management, warehousing, etc. So any and I know that you have spoken with some experience of what you would have done as an organization. So any great practices that you think you can share with our audience as to what you did differently in the post-manufacturing supply chain over the last 15 months or so?
Shridhar, you are on mute.
My apologies. So thank you for the question, Ishwar. I think it's not about what we did differently. I think we just accelerated what we always wanted to do. So that was point number 1. Point number 2, in terms of the reach to the customers, that's where we have got, and we still are discussing solutions with some good startups, where we are wanting to push our agility in the alternate channels even higher, because we are a predominantly general trade organization. So this is where our focus has been over the last 12 months.
Okay, so it's more about accelerating the deployment of technology in logistics distribution, which you did not obviously do earlier.
Absolutely, because our reach in terms of distribution is pretty large, and that's where we are focusing on.
Perfect. Thanks, Sridhar, for that. So I think that's a good start point. And Puneet, I noticed somewhere in the first slide you had tucked at the bottom a small word which said that the organizations are still discovering the ability to create a resilient supply chain. And I assume that it's a reflection of the automotive industry with who we are associated deeply. Any thoughts on, Puneet, how companies are, it's always a challenge for companies to choose between agility / resilience, and then also the cost to serve, because cost somewhere, as Shridhar said, became very important. So to that extent, how are companies really balancing the need for resilience, which could push up costs, as well as the real requirement for cost optimization? Any views on how you guys really attempted that, or you had some learnings from the marketplace?
See, yes, the resilience would come once we do understand the market as to what is the dimensions that the overall supply chain is going to take into account. We did look into these aspects while we were going through the COVID pandemic. Since we are a sort of a startup, the Citroën brand is a startup entity in India. We have yet to launch our cars, which would be mass produced in India. So we had the opportunity to go back to our suppliers, understand their constraint operations, and see how we can help and improve their processes. So it did give us an opportunity to rethink into the supply base and to understand how the processes can be improved. We did a lot of QC checks onto the supplier base, looked into their capex requirements as to how, and also looked into their funding. The funding was an important aspect that we looked into it, because since we are a global brand, we did have access to cheaper loans. So we did discuss this with our suppliers so that we can get them to borrow from our mandated banks. Uh, Thereby their cost comes down. So any cost in their equipment itself would have a bearing on our piece price at which we are going to be buying the components. So these were certain things that we tried to do. Some we were able to excel, some we were not, because the supplier would not agree to certain things. But overall, yes, all these challenges do throw us the opportunity to I generally say that it's a opportunity in adversity. So we did explore into that, and some results are going to be positive for sure, Ishwan.
Perfect. I think like what you said, I think everybody is really looking at more supplier collaboration than what it was before, especially on the automotive side, where there is a significant back end which supports the primary companies per se. One more, just an add-on to that, Puneet, since you also wear the hat of being the CFO of the organization, how are you really balancing short-term versus medium-term from a pure finance, tax, and also the reforms perspective? The government comes up with the reforms for investment, and it's a great opportunity for you to look at it. At the same time, you also look at the variability in the market and therefore the situation. So as a CFO, how are you really balancing near-term variabilities with long-term benefits, and therefore some of the big changes that are happening through interventions by the state, by the industry, etc.?
Uh, yeah, so reforms are actually, in general, when we are looking at our business case, when we do the business case for any product that we are going to be introducing, certainly we do not look into the variability from a long-term standpoint, because these variabilities are there today, they might not be there tomorrow. So our business cases generally are not built in a fashion that we are going to look into these variable interventions done by the governments. But yes, we do keep a track of that so that we do not lose out on any opportunity that is available. So we are looking ahead for the PLI scheme for the automotive to come up. Uh, there have been a state of announcement for various PLIs for other industries, but automotive is yet to be announced, though there have been talks going on for months now. And I think once that comes in, that would definitely be an area that we are going to have a look at, and see how our focus would be concentrated towards that. Other than that, the reforms do come in, and we are welcoming that. Like the tax rate cut, which was announced, though we would have appreciated if it was announced a year earlier, because we had already set up the company, and we would not be able to get the benefit of 15%, though we would have qualified for every other aspect of it. But the reforms are going to be there in India, and I think all the corporates would have to look into it and see how best to optimize them. That's my take on the reforms. Yeah. I don't know if I answered.
And I just
Ishwaran.
perfect. You're very right. As you said, what you essentially meant is that while we'll have short-term aspects coming in, you would essentially plan for the longer term and therefore take advantage of the situations in the short term, but really plan with the long term in perspective. That's how your long term plans are. So that's where you're looking at the PLI and the India investments that you're making. Got it. The second I wanted I think maybe I'll ask Sumeet and then come back to you. I'll have time for maybe one more last question from all of you. Sumeet, what's your view from an outsider's perspective? We had the CFO's view on this matter, and you serve the companies, and therefore, how do you see this, Sumeet? How are your clients across industries balancing short-term and medium-term or long-term requirements?
I think one quick word to describe it is I'm seeing a whole lot of resilience amongst companies and people to get back to normalcy, maybe at a new pedestal. And companies are looking to re-engineer some of the processes that they've been deploying in the past. And I think there is a keen desire to learn from experiences that some of the other companies which have been successful in this period. And I think one fundamental feeling or thought that I have is that as we go through this, and there are several points on which all of us, as whether businesses, whether individuals, as humans, we get tied together as wanting to respond to this whole situation that we are encountered with. But that is creating a bond which is maybe converting into some level of a better resurgence and a better connectedness on how to deal with this situation in a business environment as well. I think that's a very positive sign, which I think all of us should take forward, because at the end of the day, what this reality is downing upon us is that we don't necessarily only need development. We need sustainable development, on which each of us needs to take the baby steps and then those big steps to make sure that we are contributing to the environment as well.
Thanks, Sumit. I think we are running short of time, so therefore I think I had fewer questions than what we could, but I think we already had some great responses from both Puneet as well as from Shridhar, in addition to what they articulated. And thanks to you too, Sumit, for your comments on how the tax reforms are impacting the market. So now over back to you, Sumit, and for the closing session and the remarks. It's been an outstanding session and some great thoughts. I go with what Puneet said, looking at the longer term rather than just about the short term when you start thinking from a CFO's perspective. And second is what Shridhar said, we did things that we always wanted to do. So thank you so all of you for some fantastic thoughts, and Sumit, back to you.
Thank you, Easwaran, and likewise, thank you very much to Shridhar as well as to Puneet for helping us put together this session and contribute to the session. I think it's been most enlightening. While we don't have any particular questions at this point in time, but just as participants, if you feel you want some question addressed, maybe not at this time, but at a later point in time, feel free to write into us. We will try to respond and provide you maybe any insights that we can possibly share, even including from Shridhar and Puneet. With that, I wanted to thank BCCI also and hand it over back to Mr. Roy for the closing remarks. Mr. Roy?
It has been a short but very stimulating session on sharing of experiences from the expert speakers and those who are actually battling it out in industry like Puneet. And I'm sure all the participants would have enriched themselves, and this will help them and plant a few thoughts in their head and how to cope with the future and how to cope with these challenges, which will remain for some time and evolve gradually the most perfect models suited for each of the business needs, against the backdrop of the challenges imposed by COVID, and which could easily transform into challenges from some other black swan event also, because we are really living in uncertain times. So I do hope all of them have something very useful to take home, and at least I have benefited immensely through this short but very stimulating session. And on behalf of on behalf of BCCI, I thank all the panel speakers and the knowledge partner Deloitte for delivering a wonderful session. to Ganesh to organize on behalf to organize this session through Bombay Chambers, and to all the participants for sparing their time to be with us. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.